your first question is about the atmosphere in NATO headquarters during the radical geopolitical change. I started saying that I had come from London, where at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, I had published a little book about conventional arms control. And in my new job at the Strategic Planning Branch in the International Military Staff, I was working on a study that dealt with arms control and strategy. And when the Berlin Wall came down totally unexpectedly, I very quickly over Christmas rewrote this whole study and made it a reflection, about 60 pages, a reflection about what this all meant for NATO. And this was not so brilliant, but it was the first thing on the market. So it went everywhere. Even the NATO Secretary General called me to his office to discuss this studies and this study and my ideas for the future. And one very central thought there was that at one point in the study I said, NATO has for so many years concentrated on worst cases that now we should also think a little bit about the possibility of things going well. And this led to a discussion in the military committee, and the military committee established a military strategy working group, of which they made me the head. And in this working group, we did much of the innovative and constructive and creative work that was sent from the military side to the strategy review group, which had been established in the international staff, that is on the civilian side. But many of the ideas came from the military. And of course, all this was meant to underpin the conviction that NATO, even if it lost its enemy, in quotation marks, would remain relevant for the security of Europe and of the transatlantic region. And in November '91, there was a NATO summit in Rome, and the new strategic concept was agreed and then also published. And indeed, we thought that the Soviet threat was waning, was being reduced. And so the strategic concept was programmatically a strategy without an adversary, where we said instability is the main threat, and some others of the non-conventional menaces and security risks. So indeed, that was thinking about things going well. And at the same time, we extended the hand of cooperation to the former members of the Warsaw Pact when that resolved, and also to the Soviet Union. And anecdotically, in October 1990, the chief of the general staff of the Soviet Union, General Moiseyev, came to NATO headquarters for the first time to visit the military committee. And I, as a German and international colonel, had the task to draft for the chairman of the military committee, the highest soldier in all NATO, the welcome speech for the Soviet chief of the general staff. So that was the atmosphere: hopefulness and readiness for cooperation.
So I want to ask you about Manfred Werner, and you have been working with him, and why he is an important figure to understand transatlantic security and in general German defense policy in the 1980s. So how was it to work with him?
Well, it was quite unusual that a colonel had a close relationship with the NATO Secretary General and also with the chairman of the military committee. But since I was, so to speak, the whiz-kid of this whole strategy reform and had taken the first initiative, they trusted me, and Werner had already known me because during his time as defense ministers, I had in my portfolio a couple of subjects which interested him. For instance, Spain's NATO membership and German-French cooperation and NATO defense aid to Portugal, Turkey, Greece, and so on. So Manfred Werner had realized what an epochal change had happened. And he embarked on all the changes which we in the military strategy working group thought necessary, and he identified himself with the necessity to maintain NATO's relevance, and he played a very active part in also communicating to the outside world what needed to be changed and what was to be done. And he also agreed to the idea we promoted, that the strategic concept should be published. You know, that the strategy documents before MC14-3 was the last one, were all NATO secret. And we said, in the new time, transparency and confidence building is very important. And so it was agreed that this document, with a confidential military, purely military companion document, that this one would be published. And by the way, 4 weeks after the summit in Rome, I was sent on official mission to Moscow, where in Petrovodanya, outside Moscow, there was a big conference in the Soviet style, 30-minute presentations without any discussion, and then the next speaker and the next speaker. And I was one of the speakers, and my task was to present to this mainly Russian audience the new NATO, which could be trusted.
And what was the perception in Moscow of this new NATO openness and transparency in 1990, 1991?
That was 1991. I thought it was positive, and they were quite open-minded, and there was no in no way was there the feeling that they wanted to maintain NATO as an enemy. I think this stretched out hand for cooperation was taken seriously in the beginning, and Yeltsin was positive, and Shevardnadze was positive. And also Bush Sr., the American president, made an effort to show to show some respect and understanding for the problems, also the psychological problems that the country might have, the Soviet Union, later Russia, that had, in quotation marks, lost the Cold War. And some of the cries of triumph in America from other people were not so constructive. Another little anecdote: in 1990, there was a conference in Brussels with many international people and also some Soviet generals. And in the discussion, quite innocently and spontaneously, I made a very banal remark, saying that we should stop talking about who has won the Cold War and just say reason has won. And a couple of weeks later, I was in a dusty Moscow office building for a workshop. And I was standing in the corridor and I could not see because the sun shone through the window at the end of the corridor, and against the light, I could not recognize who was coming up to me. And that was the Soviet 3-star General Chaldimov, whom I had met at Brussels only for a short time, for a short moment, and who took me in his arm and almost with tears in his eyes reminded me of this little innocent remark, let's say reason has won and not who has lost the Cold War, because he had rightly felt that with this remark, I wanted to respect the Soviet pride. And we might have had a little more of that on the West, or on the Western side, perhaps, because political psychology is very important.
I want to ask about the Spanish accession, and Spain could become a member of NATO in 1982 only after the death of Francisco Franco and through the democratic reforms. And can you tell me please your story of how Spain joined NATO and your work with Javier Solana? So how was it for you, this Spanish experience?
Well, after General Staff training, I spent 2 years in a brigade staff, and then I came to Bonn, to the Ministry of Defense, and I was the desk officer in the political department, military political department, and I was the desk officer for NATO's southern region and Africa. Southern region meant Portugal, France, Italy, Greece, Turkey. And in that capacity, I was also the secretary of the German-Spanish Commission for Military Cooperation. And interestingly, or luckily, before General Staff training, I had not, there were 3 months of a class of a language school, where normally the future General Staff officers perfected their English or French. And I was told, you know enough English and French, what would you like to do during these 3 months? So I took an intensive Spanish course. And that was very lucky because as the secretary of the German-Spanish Commission, I could use that very well. And you may remember that only 2 enlargements of NATO had happened until 1982. One was in 1952, when Greece and Turkey joined NATO, and one was in 1955, when Germany, that is Western Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany, which did not even yet have an army, joined NATO. So NATO enlargement was not something that NATO did by routine. and there was no membership action plan and no preparation and so on. Then something happened in Spain that was the attempt of a military coup. Lieutenant Colonel Tejero occupied the Cortes, that is the parliament of Spain, and he shot in the air with his pistol. And some of the deputies disappeared under their desks, and some stood upright, like Juarez, who later became the Spanish prime minister. And the putsch was aborted because the then quite young King Juan Carlos made a very, very energetic television speech where he ordered the military to return to their barracks and to obey the orders of the politicians. And there was then a rather quick discussion in NATO that in order to help stabilize the internal conditions in Spain, NATO was ready to invite it as a member. So there was no preparation. It happened just like this, and it became even complicated because then there was an election in Spain, and the PSOE, the Socialist Party under González, won, and González wanted to leave NATO again. And I contend that with our German-Spanish Commission, sometimes behind the scenes, we did a lot to convince González that inside NATO it was better for Spain and its security than outside. And he then called a referendum with 4 easy to fulfill conditions, and the referendum was positive. Solana came to NATO much later as a Secretary General, and then later he was the High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy of the European Union. But my little conversation with Solana, which I may have mentioned in my Manfred Werner seminar presentation, was later when I met him here together with the Spanish ambassador. And I told the ambassador my involvement with Spain's NATO membership. And then I turned round to Solana and said, "Sir, that was when you still demonstrated against NATO." Because that was the case that during the preparation of the referendum, Solana, as a socialist politician, was strictly against NATO. So sometimes history is ironic.
Yeah, it really is. So let's come back to Ukraine and how was the instrument of NATO accession as membership action plan formed, and why did it become central in the negotiations with Ukraine and other post-communist countries?
You know that NATO was reluctant to issue the first invitations, and first of all established in 1994 the Partnership for Peace, PFP, which some of the aspirant countries a little bit frustrated called not Partnership for Peace, but they said PFP means Partnership for Procrastination. Yeah, to slow down the process. And NATO was, of course, reluctant for 2 reasons. There was still a lot of need for reform in the former Warsaw Pact countries, get away with the Soviet legacy, etc., etc. Modernization, incorporation into the democratic state under parliamentary control, etc. And the other reason, of course, was a certain regard to Russia, which could be expected not to be very pleased with NATO enlargement to the east. Although it has to be emphasized again and again that NATO enlargement to the east was never an aggressive expansion, but it was the urgent desire of the countries who had liberated themselves from the Soviet yoke and from the limited sovereignty in the Warsaw Pact, and who wanted to come under the security umbrella of NATO. And before the first three invitations to the Czech Republic and Poland and Hungary were issued, you know that NATO agreed with Russia and concluded the NATO-Russia Founding Act, where both countries, where NATO and Russia declared that they would not regard each other as adversaries anymore. So then the first invitations were issued, and while in the Partnership for Peace already there were some special partnerships with certain countries, and with Ukraine there was the distinct partnership and the NATO-Ukraine Commission, which had been created at the same time as the NATO-Russia Council in 1997. And the partnership in the case of countries who wanted to join NATO was regarded as some preparation for NATO membership. This was then more strongly systematized and became the MAP, the Membership Action Plan. And why did it get such an importance? In my view, because at the summit, around the summit, before and around the summit in Bucharest of 2008, when the United States absolutely wanted Ukraine and Georgia to be given the Membership Action Plan, these two countries, and at the same time Russia, and perhaps also everybody else, overestimated the importance of the Membership Action Plan. Membership Action Plan does not yet mean membership. And it is also not a guarantee for membership. And in 2008, I think, or 2007, when I had realized that the Membership Action Plan and its importance were overtaxed, I used the International Kiev Week to explain that a little bit better. And the International Kiev Week was the following. I was the Director Academic Planning and Policy at the NATO Defense College, and in that capacity, I was responsible every year in February in the break between our senior courses for the so-called membership, for the so-called Kiev Week, which meant that for 1 week, we would kind of export the NATO Defense College, which is with its personnel and its program, to the Defense Academy in Ukraine. And once I organized a panel there with the title Experiences of New NATO Members. There was a Czech general, NATO general, a former Romanian defense minister, and 2 other panelists. And my point was to explain that the Membership Action Plan does not yet mean NATO membership, but it means the beginning of the pain. Because then plans have to be made, and everybody looks into your plans and gives advice, and NATO makes demands, and it's much work. It can last a long time, and the Membership Action Plan is just the beginning of the process of preparing for NATO membership, which then in the end is still a political decision by all NATO members. Also, one has to say now when some people say don't repeat the mistake of 2008 and had Ukraine be made a NATO member, then Russia would not have attacked it. Yes, that is true, but that was a time when, as I remember, the majority of the Ukrainian people was either against NATO membership or at least indifferent. So there was no question of inviting a country whose people is not fully for NATO membership. So it was a different time, and yes, certainly had Ukraine been a member in 2014 or in 2022, Russia would not have attacked. But that was the historical chain of events.
So, what do you think Ukraine has already done for the membership, and what we also need to do more in terms of aftermath of the Vilnius summit, and where MAP was cancelled and the Commission Ukraine-NATO was transformed into the Council Ukraine-NATO. So
what did you say? What was cancelled?
Membership action plan was cancelled as an instrument for Ukraine's NATO.
It was not cancelled. It was not offered. It was not offered, and no time plan was offered. But to start psychologically, I think with the NATO-Ukraine Commission and with its participation as a partner in several NATO out-of-area missions, Ukraine has already done a lot to qualify for a NATO member, and the politicians in making this a goal of politics of Ukrainian policy have made certain steps, and now in its very brave fight against the Russian invasion, I think that Ukraine has also done a lot to qualify for NATO membership, and it is fighting for all of us. And that is why I support Ukraine wherever I can in the media and television, with articles, with presentations and discussions. But on the other hand, there is the NATO enlargement study, which was developed in 1995, already 2 years before the first invitations, and which has a couple of criteria for NATO membership. Of course, it's not a matrix where you only have to tick the boxes, and when you have ticked all boxes, then you automatically become a member. No, as I said, it's a political discussion, but there are still some conditions to be met. And one very important one is a paragraph that says a country that has a conflict with a neighbor, or irredentism, or minority conflicts in the country, has to put these disputes to rest according to the OSCE criteria before it qualifies for an invitation to NATO. Of course, it's not Ukraine's fault that it is attacked by Russia. But unfortunately, according to this condition, Russia has a kind of lever. And that is one of the reasons why already it had started the war in the Donbass, 2014. Because with such frozen conflicts, or as I prefer to say, simmering conflicts in Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine, Russia thinks it can prevent an invitation to Ukraine. I understand the disappointment. Indeed, I was with a couple of other experts. The signator, one of the signatories of an open letter, an appeal to the participants of the Vilnius summit, saying that we need a very clear signal for Ukraine, that its future is in NATO. And I found the declaration too weak. And I found that we missed an opportunity, but I do not think that the opportunity was a kind of time plan. It would have been a stronger signal that right after the war, Ukraine would be accepted by as a NATO member expeditiously. And also, even stronger, it should have been a signal to Russia. You have no say in this matter. So the declaration was that once the war is over and conditions met, Ukraine will become a NATO member, and I think personally that is too weak. And the conditions met, I think Ukraine has done a lot with his brave fighting to qualify as a NATO member. And I can only hope that the reconquering of the at present occupied areas or the necessity for Russia to withdraw its forces will be successful very soon. And I'm about to write an article about the Taurus cruise missiles that the German Air Force has, where I think that that we should give those to Ukraine in order to have even more means of hitting high-value targets quite distant behind the Russian front.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Wіттманn, General Wіттmann, for your position. And I want also to ask you about Russia. My final question. So why did NATO not recognize Russia as a threat after Putin's Munich speech, where he clearly blamed the USA for the formation of a unipolar system? And I have watched this speech recently, and I mean, it was like not 16 years past, like it was just yesterday. I mean, blaming the West for all sins and all these developments.
Yes, I was there. I sat on the balcony about 8 meters above Putin, distant from Putin. I saw how he still scribbled in his manuscript. And I have often said and written, we should have listened much better, and we should have drawn conclusions. And I remember that Joseph Joffe, an editor of Die Zeit weekly magazine, stood up as the first one in the discussion and said, Mr. President, have we just witnessed the beginning of another Cold War? Well, what were the reasons for not taking this more seriously? The wish, the desire for cooperative relations with Russia. I was one of those who over many years have developed ideas for cooperative as opposed to confrontational security with Russia. But at the same time, I have always quite clearly analyzed Putin's motives and the revanchism and the desire to revert the development in Central and Eastern Europe, revisionism as it is called, and so on. And sometimes in later years, I said in the preface, in the introduction to such an article, with Putin, I have been quite sobered about the prospects of cooperative security, but I continue with such developing such reflections in quotation marks for better times. And in speeches, I have often said that if I have learned one thing in the last 30 or so years, then that Mark Twain is right. One should never make predictions, particularly not about the future. What have we seen in terms of surprises? Positive, the fall of the Berlin Wall, negative, 9/11, and so on. So for better times, one must also be prepared, but of course also prepared against the threat. And I remember once when Lavrov, Foreign Minister Lavrov, gave a presentation in Berlin, in a hotel, and I did not get the floor when I wanted to ask him a question. So I was frustrated. They only took 3 or 4 prominent people. I was frustrated. I went out, and before the door there was radio, Russia Today television, with whom I never talk. But in that case, I was frustrated, and he asked me, can we make an interview? And I said yes. And he asked the first question, and I said, before I reply to that question, I would like to say to you what I would have liked to say to your foreign minister in the conference hall. And that is the following. Like other discussants, I am among those who say in the long term, security in Europe can only be organized with Russia and not against Russia. But the policy of your president and your government, I would have said to Lavrov, has made it that security from Russia has now gained a new priority for many people. And I would have asked him, I said, do you think that is in Russia's interest? And this whole interview with the subsequent question and answers was broadcast in Russia, which surprised me. So there were illusions about Russia as a partner, wishful thinking, and particularly in Germany, where, as you know, even after 2014, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was agreed by the Chancellor, following the wish of the former Chancellor, Gerhard Schröder, who was already in the well-paid service of the Russian government and Gazprom, and so on. Yes, those were mistakes, bad judgment, wishful thinking. And in 2014, after the, in 2008, 1 year after the speech, there was a war against Georgia, which was over rather quickly, so it was also quickly forgotten or set aside. And then 2014, the NATO reaction was stronger, but not so much acting against Russia with regard to Ukraine proper, but rather in the vein of saying, if we cannot defend Ukraine, who is not a NATO member, we must do everything that the protection and security of all NATO members is very firm. And that led to quite a number of measures at the summit in September 2014 in Wales, the readiness plans and everything. And then in 2016, the summit in Warsaw with the enhanced forward presence, multinational battle groups in the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and in Poland. But that was only NATO protection. And when in 2021, for instance, the head of the Green Party, Habeck, Germany, came back from a visit in the Donbass, and he was quite shaken emotionally, and he said, we should give Ukraine weapons for its defense. There was a storm of disagreement in Germany, even in its own party. And I wrote a letter to the editor of the Frankfurter Allgemeine supporting him. But that was still the time when in Germany we said we cannot send weapons into crisis areas, as if Ukraine was just a crisis area. And only after the beginning of the invasion, many people woke up.
Yeah, Dr. Wіттманn, and one also very important question about the Black Sea region. As a former NATO official who has been working with the Mediterranean region, why do you think NATO has not adopted its Black Sea strategy yet? I mean, during the last 20, 30 years.
Yeah, because nobody paid sufficient attention to it, quite frankly, and Turkey, who of course thinks that the Black Sea is important, drifted partly away from NATO, became a very difficult NATO ally, and tried to be friendly with Russia. And I think we fell for the Russian vision of the Black Sea as being a region partly dominated by Russia. That was another oversight, misjudgment, and yes, I myself always had the plan to write a book, but this never came to pass, because I was inspired by an article from a professor in Bonn, which was titled "The Lakes of Europe." And it's the beginning of a comparison between the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, and the Mediterranean. And I always would have liked to continue that project and compare them even better, and make as the lead question, what does the Baltic Sea have to tell the others? Because the cooperation about the Baltic Sea is densest and most intense. And what could the river, the countries adjacent to the other quotation mark lakes of Europe learn from the cooperation around the Baltic Sea? I never did it. I have a couple of books in my bookshelf about the Black Sea, and I think it was neglected, because even NATO cannot deal with the same intensity with all the subjects that are on the table. And I think with the hopeful progress that the Ukraine counteroffensive and the help of the 50 NATO and other countries will make, that we will then also contest the Russian claim to dominate the Black Sea.